I learned to live without you. I can still remember the sound of the front door slamming behind them. Not a gentle goodbye, not a promise that they'd return soon, just the hard, final slam of two people who had decided, for reasons I'll never fully understand, that I wasn't worth the effort of staying. I was 7 years old. My little brother was 4. And just like that, the two people who were supposed to protect me, who were supposed to love me unconditionally, vanished. I remember standing in the hallway, my small hands clutching the edge of the banister, staring at the space where they had been. I called for them. My brother called for them. The air was heavy, thick with absence, and I remember the quiet settling in like an anchor I couldn't lift. That was the first lesson I learned. Sometimes the people who are meant to love you the most choose not to, and it is not your fault. We were left with our grandmother. She was old, tired, worn down by her own hardships, but she tried. She did what she could: food on the table, school clothes that were patched in places, bedtime stories read with a shaky voice. But she couldn't be my parents. She couldn't fill the space they had abandoned. And I resented her for it, sometimes, though I knew it wasn't her fault. She was all we had left, and still, it wasn't enough. I learned quickly that survival was mine to figure out. I learned to cook, clean, do laundry, and manage myself in ways that children should never have to. I learned to quiet the questions in my mind: why did they leave me? Did I do something wrong? Don't they love me? I buried those questions because they had no answers, only emptiness. And emptiness, I learned, is something you can survive if you armor yourself against it. School was another battlefield. Other kids had parents who came to pick them up, who attended their events, who called them on birthdays. I had a grandmother who couldn't always make it, and siblings who were just as abandoned as I was. I learned to laugh, to smile, to act as if everything was fine. But inside, I was raw, always raw. I was a girl who knew what it meant to be invisible, to be unwanted, to be left behind. And then life moved on. I moved on. But I carried them with me in every relationship I formed, in every choice I made. I learned to measure people by their consistency, their presence, their willingness to stay when it mattered most. And I became cautious. Too cautious, some would say. Too distant, too guarded. But that caution was armor forged from years of absence, from nights spent listening to my brother's cries, from mornings spent staring at empty chairs, from birthdays and holidays that were celebrated with hollow smiles and patched together meals. Decades later, they returned. Not physically at first: letters. Handwritten, trembling with guilt, with regret, with desperation. They were older, frail, and expected that their words could erase decades of absence. They asked for my help. They asked for forgiveness. They expected me to step in, to care for them, to erase the consequences of their choices. And for a moment, I allowed myself to feel something: maybe hope, maybe anger, maybe the echo of the little girl I once was who still wanted parents. But I did not answer. I did not call. I did not even throw the letters away. I kept them in a box under my bed, like a relic, like proof of what they had tried and failed to fix. I reread them sometimes, not out of guilt, not out of longing, but to remind myself of the truth: I am not theirs anymore. I am not the child they abandoned. I am the woman who survived, who thrived, who learned to live without them. And here's the confession, the part I need to say out loud even if no one is listening: part of me wants to see them suffer for what they left behind. Not in a cruel way, but in the way life can be bitterly ironic. I want them to feel, even if just a shadow of it, what it was like to be abandoned, to have their choices matter more than a child's existence. But I also mourn the child I was, the one who needed them, the one who loved them despite everything. I learned early that love is not owed. Forgiveness is not owed. Presence is not owed. And they forfeited every claim the moment they walked away. And so, I continue to live my life, carrying both the ache of absence and the triumph of survival. After the letters, the calls began. My mother first, her voice trembling, soft, pleading, as if decades of absence could be erased by a single conversation. My father followed, his voice initially clipped and formal, then faltering, shaking with age and desperation. "We were wrong," they said. "We didn't know how to be parents. Please, help us." I listened once, twice, and then I stopped. I stopped answering because I knew the truth. They weren't asking for me, they were asking to soothe their own guilt. Their apologies were tools, not truths. And still, part of me wanted to pick up the phone. The girl I once was, the 7-year-old who cried herself to sleep while they were away, wanted to believe them. That child, so small and hopeful, imagined that maybe, just maybe, they had returned to fix what they broke. But that child had been abandoned, again and again, and I had learned that hope was dangerous when offered by people who had never stayed. I remember lying awake at night, thinking about what they had missed. My first day at high school, standing in the doorway while other parents hugged their children and sent them off with kisses and encouragement, while I swallowed the lump in my throat and pretended not to notice. My first crush, the first heartbreak, the first time I got a prize at school, none of it mattered to them, and their absence carved into my heart a hollow that never healed. I learned to be independent, almost brutally so. I learned that relying on others would only invite disappointment. And I carried that lesson with me into adulthood. Every relationship, every trust extended, every love accepted was measured against the possibility of betrayal, absence, or abandonment. They had set the standard. And I refused to let anyone meet it without proving they could be counted on. The calls became more desperate over time. My mother's voice would break mid-sentence, pleading for attention, for care, for validation. My father, who had always been proud, sounded smaller and more fragile with each attempt, his desperation thinly veiled behind words of need. And yet, I did not answer. I could not. Because doing so would have been to invite them back into the life they had forsaken decades ago. And the child I once was, the one who had curled up with my stuffed animals crying in the dark, deserved protection. Sometimes I imagined them standing in front of me, begging, pleading for the son or daughter they left behind. I imagined telling them everything, the nights I cried, the birthdays I celebrated alone, the fear I had learned to live with, the lessons I had to teach myself about trust and love. I imagined their shame, their regret, the realization that the life they abandoned had consequences they could no longer undo. But I did not speak. I did not grant them that satisfaction. I could not. Because survival is not about cruelty. Survival is about protecting the child you once were. Survival is about ensuring that the pain of abandonment does not repeat itself. And I had survived. I had endured. I had built a life from the ruins they left behind. Even now, decades later, I carry the memory of their absence in everything I do. Some nights I ache for what could have been, for the life of love and attention that was stolen from me. But I also know that my life is mine, built from resilience, strength, and lessons no apology can ever undo. They cannot reclaim me. They cannot erase what they left behind. And so I remain. Silent. Cautious. Strong. Guarded. Because the child I once was deserves no less. Because the woman I have become cannot afford less. And because sometimes, the greatest act of survival is never opening the door to those who abandoned you. Then they came in person. My mother first, one chilly autumn morning, carrying a basket of homemade food, as if a loaf of bread or a jar of jam could undo the decades she had missed. I opened the door just enough to see her standing there, eyes wide, trembling, silently begging me to let her back in. She tried to explain, to apologize, to remind me of who I once was in their lives. But I had grown since then. I was no longer the little girl who had curled up in the dark, waiting for footsteps that never came. I was a woman shaped by absence, forged by loneliness, and armored by every hurt they had caused. I just want a chance to explain, she said, her voice breaking. Please. I made mistakes, but I need you now. We need you. I didn't answer. I couldn't. I let the silence stretch, long and unyielding, until she realized that no apology, no bread, no tears could erase what they had done. Her expression shifted from hope to shock to shame. She left without another word, the basket abandoned on the porch, like her attempts to fix the past half-hearted, fragile, and ultimately meaningless. A week later, my father appeared. Stooped, frail, a cane in hand, his pride diminished by years and illness. We're alone, he said simply. Please, you're all we have left. I looked at him and saw the same man who had abandoned me at 7, who had chosen himself over his child, who had allowed me to grow in solitude. I saw the weight of all the birthdays he missed, all the nights he was absent, all the milestones he ignored. And I understood something clearly: he was not my responsibility. He had forfeited that right when he left. I said nothing. I let the silence speak. It spoke volumes. Decades of absence cannot be erased by frail apologies or pleading words. And in that silence, I felt a bitter satisfaction, not cruelty, but clarity. I had survived. I had grown. I had become someone who would never again allow herself to be abandoned without consequence. And I was not about to start now. They did not give up easily. Letters continued to arrive, claiming illness, financial hardship, loneliness, regrets too heavy to bear alone. Calls came daily, urgent, trembling, begging for attention and care. Small gifts followed: clothes, food, even photographs of distant relatives I barely recognized. I kept them all, carefully tucked away in a box under my bed. Sometimes I opened it, sometimes I did not. They were reminders, not invitations. Proof that they tried and failed to rewrite history without acknowledging the harm they caused. And the truth was unbearable and simple: I could not forgive them. Not fully. Not in the way they wanted. I could pity them, yes. I could observe their frailty. I could feel sorrow for their loneliness. But I could not allow them back into my life. I could not let them step over the boundaries I had spent decades building. The child I had been, the little girl who once longed for parents, was still alive inside me. And I protected her fiercely. I would not allow her to be hurt again. I would not allow the people who abandoned her to disrupt the life she had fought so hard to create. Survival demanded this, and survival had always been the only truth I could trust. Even now, years later, I remember every abandoned birthday, every empty chair, every silent night. And I carry both grief and triumph: grief for what was stolen from me, triumph for what I built without them. I have learned that some wounds do not heal, some scars never fade, and some parents can never truly be parents. And I have learned that the only love I can trust completely is my own, the love I give myself for having survived. After the in-person visits, the desperation escalated. My mother began showing up at places she knew I frequented: small cafes, the grocery store, even my office building, always holding that same pleading expression, always murmuring, "We need you, please." She tried to touch my arm, to reach for my hand, as if the years of absence could be erased by a single gesture. I flinched every time, feeling the old wound snap open like raw nerves. I did not let her close. I did not let her back in. My father followed suit, though more cautiously. He would send letters with medical notes, with details of ailments and hospital visits. He would ask for my guidance, my assistance, my forgiveness. I read them, every word, every tear-stained sentence. I could feel the years of absence and negligence condensed into every line. But I could also feel my own strength, the armor I had built over decades. And I understood again that some mistakes cannot be undone. Some wounds, no matter how much someone cries over them, are permanent. I thought often about the little girl I once was, the one who clutched her blanket at night, wondering why her parents had left, why they could not love her as she needed. She would have opened the door. She would have cried and begged and forgiven. But that girl no longer lives in the world in the same way. The woman I became protects her fiercely. The woman I became refuses to hand her back to the people who abandoned her, no matter how frail, desperate, or regretful they appear now. Sometimes I imagine sitting them down, telling them everything, the nights I spent crying, the birthdays celebrated alone, the years spent learning how to survive without them. I imagine the shame on their faces, the realization that they cannot reclaim what they abandoned. But I do not do this. I do not speak because speaking would be a gift to them, a chance to ease their conscience. And I have learned that no one who abandoned you deserves that gift. I have learned, painfully and irrevocably, that survival is not about forgiveness. Survival is about boundaries. Survival is about protecting the child you once were, the girl who had no one, from the adults who failed her. I survived them. I thrived despite them. And that is my triumph. Even now, decades later, I remember every absence, the empty chairs, the missed school plays, the birthdays and holidays that they skipped. I carry those memories with a mixture of sorrow and clarity. Sorrow for the life I never had, clarity that I have built a life they cannot touch, a life born of resilience and determination. I am not the child they abandoned. I am the woman who survived, who refuses to let them back in, who refuses to let their regrets dictate my life. And in that realization, I understand the bitterest truth: they will age, they will falter, they will die carrying remorse they cannot undo. And I will continue, steadfast, carrying both the grief of absence and the triumph of survival. The child I once was deserves no less, and the woman I became refuses to compromise that. Years passed. Decades, really. The letters slowed. The visits became less frequent. Eventually, I think, they stopped altogether, not because they gave up, not because they understood the weight of what they had done, but because age, illness, and the inevitability of their own mortality finally silenced their desperate attempts. It didn't matter. By then, the child I had been and the woman I had become had already taken up the space they abandoned. Their absence had defined the contours of my life, shaped my strength, and forged the boundaries I would never allow them to cross. I am older now. I carry the echoes of their abandonment in everything I do. Some nights, I dream of them not as parents, not as people, but as shadows. Figures who were supposed to love me, to guide me, and who chose instead to leave. I feel sorrow not for them, not really, but for the child I once was, the little girl who held her stuffed animals tight in the dark and wished desperately for them to return. I mourn that loss endlessly. But I do not feel regret. I cannot. I survived. I thrived. I built a life that was entirely my own. I cultivated love, friendship, success, and joy in the absence of those who should have given it freely. And in that, there is a triumph that no apology, no pleading, no regret from them could ever undo. The bitter truth, which I have come to accept fully, is that their remorse cannot heal the wounds of abandonment. They cannot reclaim the years, the milestones, the moments they missed. They cannot step back into a life they chose not to nurture. I carry the evidence of their absence in my memory, in my heart, and in the life I forged alone. And that life is mine, untainted by the fleeting guilt they now feel. Sometimes, I imagine telling them everything: the nights I cried, the birthdays I celebrated alone, the endless effort I put into becoming someone whole without their guidance. I imagine their faces falling in disbelief, in shame, in recognition of what they lost. But I never do. Speaking would be a gift, a momentary comfort, and they have earned none of it. I have learned that love is not owed, that forgiveness is not owed, that presence is not owed. And they forfeited all of those the moment they walked away. The child I once was deserves protection. the woman I have become deserves autonomy. And so I keep the door closed. Even now, decades later, I feel the ache of what could have been the life of warmth, guidance, and unconditional love that was stolen from me. But I also feel the strength of what I built in their absence, a life of resilience, independence, and dignity. They will age. They will falter. They will pass into silence carrying the weight of regrets they cannot undo. And I will remain, standing in the quiet triumph of survival, carrying both grief and the knowledge that I am whole despite them. I am not the child they abandoned. I am not their burden to reclaim. I am the woman who learned to live without them, who refused to let their absence define me as broken, who refused to let their regrets dictate my life. And in that refusal, in that steadfast survival, I find the quiet victory that they will never know, the triumph of a child abandoned, who became whole despite everything.